It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, and this is Monster Mondays, presented to you by Film Seizure. You can catch new episodes of Film Seizure with myself and Jason Oliver on Wednesdays, but Mondays are for me to talk about monster movies. I knew at some point we'd probably get to this topic, but it also kind of ties in with last week's episode to a certain extent as well. You might remember last week I talked about the comedy Bloodsucker Jones. It was something I became aware of through attending various horror conventions here in the Midwest. This week's feature, 2018's The Rake, is very similar. First, a tidbit of backstory. At Horror Hound Cincinnati in 2019, I watched a movie called Skeletons in the Closet. That movie is basically a love letter to the monster kids of the 80s. Mostly the types that would sit around in front of the TV on weekends and watching hosted programs. These days, most of these horror hosts have moved on to online avenues, but in the 80s, you had Sammy Terry here in central Indiana, Elvira on a more national level, and if you lived in cities or markets like Chicago's Svengoolie, you likely had your own local host. Each of these colorful personalities had mostly shown older movies. Later, of course, you'd have people like Joe Bob Briggs or Rhonda Shear or Gilbert Gottfried or programs like Mystery Science Theater 3000 kind of filling in that void. Now, I felt that Skeletons in the Closet was a decent anthology of short horror-themed stories, but the connecting tissue of a little girl only wanting to watch her favorite horror host, the skeletal Charlie, and his murderous wife, the Widow, was great. Charlie and the Widow were pretty great as well. They were fun and playful, and the movie really recaptured some of that pre-streaming, before cable offered hundreds of channels kind of feeling. After seeing the movie at the convention, I was walking around and spotted that the co-writer and co-director Tony Wash was there. And he was selling copies of Skeletons in the Closet, as well as some of his other movies. One of those other movies was The Rake. Now, we'll be getting to the plot of The Rake shortly, but this movie kind of falls in with a new form of storytelling and kind of telling those spooky campfire tales to give people nightmares and have them check under their beds before getting in. And that's called Creepypasta. Now, Creepypasta is an internet phenomenon. It really is just a new way of passing along scary tales. And how they work is that particularly adept storytellers will go into message boards and tell a spooky story. It's all in that storytelling. And if you have any way of providing additional media like pictures or videos, perfect. Mostly these stories detail a ghastly murder or some sort of a suicide, but all have some sort of supernatural or unexplained element. And the term creepypasta comes from a portmanteau of copy-paste or copypasta. Basically, it means creepy stories that have been copied and pasted online to viral extents. Probably the most commonly known story that has achieved mainstream fame is that of the Slender Man. That's mostly because of a 2014 stabbing that took place in Wisconsin, where two girls believed in the tall, skinny creature and thought if they went out and killed someone, it would appease the creature, protect their families from attack, and maybe they would become the Slender Man's proxies to carry out more murders. So in The Rake, the movie opens in the mid-90s as young Ben and Ashley find their parents murdered seemingly by a sociopath or a psychopath who cuts his own eyes out and slashes his throat after claiming to have given himself over to transformation by way of this entity that he calls the Rake. 20 years later, we meet Nicole and Andrew, who are moving into a new home after spending a long time in California. Nicole is the cousin of Ashley and Ben, but is really kind of the adopted sister more than anything, because Ashley and Ben went to live with Nicole and her parents after their parents died. Ashley is still really struggling pretty hard with depression, anxiety, sleeplessness, night terrors, and so forth. She doesn't really have many friends and can't seem to really connect to people at all. In fact, she doesn't seem to get along at all with Andrew. However, it's not like Andrew is all that normal of a dude either. At one point, he kind of cuts himself clipping his toenails, which, I guess that's possible, but I've never done that, so I'm not sure how he does it other than he's just like, I don't know, frazzled by Ashley or something. But he totally flips out, and he's having this scene in this bathroom where he's just having like this silent rage flip out, all because Ashley kind of upsets his perfect zen. And at the same time, out in the kitchen, Nicole cuts herself on a knife. And when Ashley tries to help clean up the blood, her hand turns into like the scary monster hand that she can see, but nobody else can see it. So Ashley is struggling with visions of what she saw the night her parents died. And in these visions, her parents are always saying that it's in you too, or some creepy stuff like that. And in Nicole and Andrew's basement, she believes she sees a dead fetus, but it's really just kind of a night terror. So the next day comes and Ben arrives with Nicole's father's old leather chair. And as Andrew is kind of helping him bring it into the house, he cuts himself again. So apparently this guy is just, I don't know, bleeding everywhere. And I kind of like that it's a little bit of a red herring about all this instances of these of things that are happening with blood. But that's a little bit of a spoiler. It's a little bit of a red herring, but it kind of builds this kind of idea of like, maybe it's blood that brings the rake around, or maybe it's just, the rake is causing these people to be accident prone or something like that. But anyway, Ben hears that Ashley had an episode the night before and is really concerned because, as he thought, she was supposedly getting better. She was taking pills. She was not having visions or night terrors or anything like that anymore. So, and one of the things that he's really concerned about is, much like the guy who killed their parents, Ashley also self-harms by way of cutting. Now, considering Andrew basically tells Ashley to either stop being crazy or leave, Ashley tries to leave, claiming that she's doing this for everybody's own good. Nicole ultimately convinces her to stay at least until the end of dinner so that she can see her brother. And speaking of Ben, he's on his way to the dinner party at Nicole and Andrew's place with his girlfriend, Michelle. And Andrew kind of continues his hate on Ashley as he tells Nicole that she should have just let her leave because she's toxic, because, all the crazy and stuff. Now, at the dinner party, Nicole reveals that she's pregnant, which triggers an unhappy memory of when Ashley had to abort a pregnancy that she had a year and a half ago or so. And Andrew scolds Ashley for not being happy for Nicole. But after Ashley explains her history of being pregnant, this only basically enrages Andrew that much more. Now later, Ashley asks Ben if all of this feels familiar. She tells him that there was more in that house than the psycho who killed her parents. And she said that the entity threatened to tear her baby out of her. Basically, every night she would have that same nightmare. So, she heard that entity, the Rake, basically whispering to Nicole when she was telling people that she was pregnant. It was whispering the name Savannah, which is the name Nicole said she had picked if it was a girl, something that she hadn't told anybody other than Andrew up to that point. Ben tells her that she just kind of needs to get over this Rake obsession business. However, Ben starts seeing some things too. Ashley sees a naked woman in the woods and follows her, and it turns into this really spooky, scary monster thing. Ben tells Michelle and Nicole that Ashley isn't herself and that they need to find her. Soon, the Rake reveals itself and begins killing members of the dinner party. And however, Ashley is missing at first. And when Ben and Nicole start discovering that something pretty terrible is going on, Ben tries to lock Nicole in a closet and looks for Ashley. However, you have an unstable person who believes she's seeing monsters, who is starting to come apart after, he does some unthinkable stuff. And the curse seems to be kind of passing itself from one person to the next without end. So let's get to my three things that I like about Tony Wash's The Rake. First, I quite like that this movie takes its time. It's a little bit of a slow burn. Well, I mean, the movie is only 78 minutes long, so considering it takes its time and not just throws monsters and jump scares at you every 2 minutes or so is really pretty good. It lets little things happen, like showing a monster hand, or having a killer with his eyes cut out, or saving the reveal of the rake for reflections in the mirror. It feels less like a modern day horror movie and something a little bit more old fashioned, a little bit slower. It takes its time. It lets things build. Next, I really like how Andrew basically becomes more and more of a completely hateful and unlikable asshole as each scene passed. He's completely hateful towards Ashley, and he's actually kind of realistic, unfortunately, in one regard. Some people are just completely incapable of being sympathetic towards those who are not mentally or emotionally stable. While there are plenty of reasons to be suspicious of Ashley in terms of it being a horror movie about an evil monster using people as conduits to spread death and what have you, there are people who really feel that, really kind of feel that anger that Andrew has. Additionally, Michelle, Ben's girlfriend, is another type who deals with people who aren't strong. She's one of those people who just powers through with their A-type personalities. It's fine. Everything is fine if you just pull yourself up by your bootstraps and just be normal and stuff. That sort of mentality. It kind of, in Andrew's case, it really kind of helps make you think that, is Andrew the person that's going to be the next psychopath or something like that? It's really interesting how they kind of sow those seeds of people being just kind of basically just done with Ashley's bullshit. Now, finally, I love that they save the actual rake creature for the final third of the movie. There's no rush to show the monster through anything other than drawings. So when it does appear, it is basically just first thought to be visions, but then becomes real, and it totally messes people up. It also saves exactly how much you see of it and in what kind of lighting for better effect. In the climax, something truly fucking gross happens that was hard for me to look at. In fact, it was hard for me to even like I almost had to plug my ears too, because it just had this wonderful, gross makeup and sound effects going for it. Now, I'm not exactly sure why this movie doesn't have a very good rating from people on the Internet Movie Database, IMDb. It's pretty well made for an indie. I mean, there are only really 6 people in the bulk of this movie, plus the monster. So it's kind of possible it brought in a crowd expecting it to be a goosebump-inducing thing like the Creepypasta stories passed around online. In other words, this is made for a slightly older audience than those who lose sleep over creepy stories they read on message boards. And, I did end up reading some of the user reviews on IMDb, and yeah, most of the lowest marks come from people saying that there's no story. Where's the story? What did I just watch? There was no story, and on and on and on. And most said that nothing was explained. There was no point to the movie, and so forth and so on. And you know what I like least in a horror movie? A detailed account of why something is going around and killing people. Sometimes spooky shit is just spooky. Do all creepypasta have detailed backstories about why the monster exists? If so, I'm glad I don't really read any of them. The Rake is perfectly fine for a slightly slower burn monster movie made on a limited budget. The actors are good. The creature is gross as all get out. The ramp up to what's going on is perfectly fine. You can do a hell of a lot worse in most horror movies these days. Give indie horror a chance. Give lower budget movies and slow burn movies a chance. Don't be a person who needs everything spelled out and detailed for you. Well, that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. Until next week, I'll see you later. And don't forget to check out new episodes of Film Seizure every Wednesday and a new installment of Monster Mondays each Monday on filmseizure.com. as well as places where fine podcasts are found like SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Spotify. And you can also check out new posts on my website, bmovieanima.com, each and every Friday.